So we're going to jump into our next presentation. This is a panel discussion linking fire history, NEK, tribal perspectives of fire management. So the purpose of the panel is to discuss and consider the lack of ignitions that's led to decreased occurrence of fire. And our speakers are going to merge lines of evidence that support the historical, cultural use of fire, and are going to discuss the influence of cultural suppression on fire history. So we have Kurt Kippmuller, the University of Minnesota, Lane Johnson with the Cloquet Forestry Center, Lee Johnson with the Superior National Forest, the Forest Service, Brian Jackson, a biologist at Quetico Provincial Park, and also Damon Ponick. And then Evan Larson is unable to join us today, but also contributed a lot to the materials coming together for this. So with that, I will hand it off to you, Kurt.
Thanks, Caitlin. So I want to just start off with a short sort of background information just to lay a foundation for what we're going to discuss and talk about. And hopefully what I present in this sort of short series of slides will generate some questions, both among the panelists, but also for the audience too. So go ahead, you can change it, start with the next slide. So all of us here have a pretty good understanding of how fire works, but I thought we could step back for just a little bit. And there's a quote from Wright and Heinzelman from their 1973 special issue of Quaternary Research that dealt with basically a rethinking of how fire operated on the landscape. And the Heinzelman paper is probably something that most are familiar with. The 1973 paper that came out that discussed fire-dependent forests in the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness. And the quote is, "We need to understand more thoroughly the relative roles of lightning and man as fire factors in the primeval system. And the key question is whether lightning alone is an adequate source of ignition to account for the observed extent of burning." That's almost 60 years ago, or almost 50 years ago, I guess now. And we still seem to be in some ways in the same place. We know a lot about how fire operates on the landscape. We know a lot about the importance of fire as an ecological process. We maybe know a little bit less about fire as a cultural process, but I feel like we're learning a little bit more about that. The point is that we understand a lot about how fire works and fire dependency. But even after 50 years, we still, as Timo just really sort of eloquently laid out, we're still having difficulties with putting fire on the ground in a way that makes some sense. And so I'm going to provide a foundation and just some background based on what we do. And I think some of you are probably familiar with this. I'm going to invite my panelists to jump in and correct me when I'm wrong or add something if needed. I can't see if everybody's all here, but I assume you are. So let's just start with a background in, so the next slide, Caitlin. Okay, so what I'm going to try to lay out is what we know based on the tree ring record. Obviously, there's a lot we don't know, and I want to talk a little bit about some of the uncertainties, but I want to lay a little bit of just a little basic overview of how we understand what fire has done in the past based on our understanding from tree rings. So next slide. So most of the work that I'm going to talk about with respect to data approaches come from these decaying stumps that are around the landscape. That triangular shaped wound on the front of that stump is a cat face, and that cat face represents the healing curls of repeated fires that have burned by the base of that particular tree. One of the misconceptions is that we're out there cutting down living trees all over the landscape. And yeah, living trees do have a really nice record of fire history, but in a lot of cases, we can't do that or don't do that because we don't want to damage the resource too much. So we use these stumps. In other cases, that's all we have. The overstory is completely different from what it was when these fires were burning, and we don't have preserved fire events except for from these fire-scarred stumps. So in some cases, we're using the fire-scarred stumps as a record of fire occurrence because that's what's there. In other cases, we're using them because we're trying to be respectful of the landscape that we're working on. But these aren't sticking around for a long time. They are well preserved now. The resin that's built up behind the wound itself preserves them. It prevents them from decaying. But they will eventually decay, or they'll burn up with repeated fires, or they just rot away. Next slide. So when you cut into one of these stumps, every time a fire burns along the base of a tree, if it doesn't kill the tree outright, it might just kill the cambium right below the bark. Well, that tree will heal itself, and as it heals itself, it will capture that wound within the annual rings of the tree. And so what you end up with are these records of repeated fires that are recorded as that fire passes by the base of the tree. Now, not every fire will be recorded. So in some cases, a fire might not burn hot enough, or it might not burn right at the base of the tree to cause a fire scar. But if we collect these over many trees, we can build a record of fire history for a landscape or for a region as we sort of, I guess, take a census of the passage of fire over time. So next slide. Okay, so this is what we call a data-rich slide, or you could call it a very, very busy slide. Depends on your point of view. I take responsibility for, I guess, making what I would call a busy slide. So I want to kind of walk through this relatively slowly and just give you a sense of the sorts of information that we have from tree rings really, really quickly. So if we start on the far right of the slide, you see the stacked diagram with all these red triangles on it. So that's a record of fire in northern Minnesota and Quetico that's built from the Boundary Waters, Voyageurs National Park, Itasca State Park, Chippewa National Forest, Quetico Provincial Park, Cloquet Forestry Center, and Minnesota Point. So it's a record of from 744 trees and stumps that we've collected over the last 10 years or so as an estimate, in some cases longer than that. And each one of the horizontal gray lines represents the time span that's covered by a tree. Now, I don't expect you to be able to see all 744. The point is that there's a bunch of data that we've built this up over time. Each one of the red triangles represents a fire event that's been recorded within the tree rings. So that's the right-hand side, and I'll come back to that in a second. The middle figure represents the intervals, the blue bars, the intervals between adjacent fires on any of the samples. So they're broken down into 4-year bins, moving all the way across from relatively frequent fires or short interval fires on the left to longer intervals on the far right. So the red bars represent what we would call time since last fire. So that's the time between the very last fire recorded on a site in 2015. And so there are some practical reasons why we did it that way, or why I did it that way, which we can get into too. But what I want you to notice is that the intervals between fires are relatively short. And I've highlighted that 10 to 14 year bar as being the peak. Most of those intervals are relatively short. It's expressed as a percentage. I believe that there are 2,000 intervals in the blue bars. So most of the fires that we've reconstructed over time, the between fire interval fires, are relatively short. The red bar, it's clearly shifted. And basically, the comparison between these two shows that since the last fire occurred in these stands, that interval has shifted out a long, long way. So basically, I'm telling you what you kind of already know, that there hasn't been a lot of fire in the last 100 or so years. The left diagram is something that we're just starting to kind of get a handle on. And on the bottom, that's the size of a tree when it first recorded its first fire. So the diameter at first fire scar. Okay, so how big was the tree when it recorded its first fire year? It's something that we've been interested in because you might think that the really, really large trees will survive and record fires pretty easily, and that the small trees are all going to get burned up and dead. It turns out that actually even pretty small trees, 5 centimeters in diameter, record a scar instead of dying. So their first scar is recorded when they're relatively small. Corresponding to this data above it is the age at first scar. So not just the size, but how old was that tree when it was first scarred. And so the peak is around 50 years. Most trees are scarred within their first 50 years of life. Obviously, it can stretch out a little bit as well. So back to the right-hand side. So those three things sort of frame our understanding of what we can pick up. So relatively small trees can record fires. There have been really short interval fires over the longer record. Those fire intervals have stretched out since about 1900, and we're starting to see much, much longer intervals. So we're going a long time without a fire in a lot of these places. And on the far right, the two patterns that I want to point out And remember, this is 744 trees from about 55 separate sites from those larger landscapes. So the thing that always jumps out immediately is the post 1900 interval, where there's almost no fires. Yeah, there are a few here and there, but for the most part, it's pretty barren with respect to fire occurrence. The other thing that sort of jumps out is the early 1700s, right around the 1730s. You see this dramatic increase in fire activity. So between about 1730 and about 1900, that's where we have these really, really high frequency, short interval, low severity fire events. And these are restricted mostly to red pine samples and red pine forests. But it's really clear that fire has been a prominent part of this landscape for a long time. I feel like I'm preaching to the choir here. We'll probably get into this, maybe the nuance a little bit more. But one of the things that we want to do is use this data to help kind of get us away from sort of the academic discussions about fire and fire history, to think about how this data might be helpful for fire management, for mitigation plans, or trying to get fire back on the ground. So how does this data help to inform us? But thinking back to this more recent period, this 1900s to present, we've traditionally thought of that as a fire suppression effect. So next slide. So since about the 1940s, we've had this really prominent campaign that's helped us to, I guess, manage the landscape in a particular way. And so that dearth of fires post 1900 is often considered to be the Smokey the Bear effect. We've gotten really, really good at putting out fires when they start. Another way to look at that, and I think an important way to look at that, is to think not so much about how effective we've been at putting fires out, but how effective we've been at preventing fires from starting. So next slide. So one of the things that Timo was talking about that I'm going to try to jump onto. So these are some old signs that we found in the wilderness. And, I think Lee can talk about this in a little bit more detail. Lee Johnson can. But these are some typical signage that were found in the wilderness or in the woods back right around the turn of the century, that it made explicit pushes to try to prevent people from igniting fires and from starting fires in the landscape. So Timo talked a little bit about this, how there's a tradition of burning private parcels. People were out burning their own landscapes. That all kind of came to a stop right around the formation of the national forests. That all sort of came to a stop. And there's obviously a reason for that, and that fire was considered to be bad because it damaged or reduced merchantable timber. And so we made a concerted effort to put those fires out. And there are lots of reasons for that. I'm going to back off a little bit and let the panelists and maybe some of the questions kind of come in so we can have a discussion now that you've got a little bit of background on at least the basics of the data that we have.
Okay, Kurt. So do you guys want to start with some questions that we have for you guys, or do you want to let others from your panel weigh in at this point?
Lee, can you speak a little bit more to the kind of the cultural phenomenon around the turn of the century and with the establishment of the Superior National Forest or the Ontario Forest Reserve?
Yeah, I can. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, I can, and maybe ask Brian to chime in a little bit too on the Ontario side of things. So, one of my interests has been really, getting involved with this project was looking at the fire intervals and trying to bring cultural context to bear, whether it's through the historic record, the archaeological record, tribal oral history, to try to, tease out humans as an ignition source. And I think, when we all got involved in this, we had some high hopes that, there would still be, there would be really good data there, and really good data in the form of oral history from some of the band members that we've talked to. Lac La Croix First Nation is sandwiched by around Quetico Provincial Park and the Superior National Forest to the south. And we also worked with band members from Fond du Lac, Grand Portage, and Bois Forte to try to tease out some of the oral tradition. And again, we're all kind of talking around this concept of humans as ignition sources. And as far as the administrative side of things, these two signs really illustrate. So the fire suppression, side of things with the establishment of the provincial park. I think, Brian, that was 1909 as well. The forest was proclaimed in 1909. Go ahead, Quadco.
Yeah, forest reserve in 1909 and a provincial park in 1913. So.
Yep, and
So
what we see, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so that sign would be sometime between 1909 and 1913 when it was being called a forest reserve.
Yep. And really commensurate with this and a little bit prior, the treaty making period, for us, 1850s down here, 1860s, and I think a little bit later for Canada, 1870s, Treaty 3, you had a real retraction of, in this case, the Ojibwe, land use systems where people were really retracted back to the reservation, along with these signs you're seeing, really explicit penalties and fines for putting fire on the ground. So I would just bring that, into the discussion as a real significant change in land use around the turn of the century. And certainly Ojibwe folks continued to go off reservation for ricing and fishing, but as far as putting fire on the ground, it was a sea change at that time. And we found too in conversations with elders that there was, everyone knows, that their ancestors put fire on the ground and they can describe the reasons for doing it. But as far as having that linear connection of exactly where the resource side of things, the specificity of it is not there anymore in many cases. And I guess I would just throw that out there for discussion or for the panel to pick up on. Does that get to your question, Lane?
Yeah, and just from the to add to from the Quetico thing, as Lee mentioned, treaties were in Treaty 3 in Canada was signed in 1873, which actually this part of the world was not part of Ontario at the time. It became part of Ontario a few years later, and through some government weird stuff, Ontario didn't completely accept all the treaties. They said it wasn't signed with us, so we can. They reserved the ability to not agree with the reserve. They agreed with the treaties, not with the reserve areas. I guess that was what they were arguing against. And originally there were two communities associated with Quetico. The one that became the community at Lac La Croix, and another group called the Sturgeon Lake Band, who had a reserve designated for them near the east side of the park, Kanipi Lake, Kawa Bay area. And that was eliminated shortly after the park was created in 1913. Pretty dark point in history of Quetico Park. It was, they removed it. The community had been hit really hard with influenza, and they went in, eliminated the reserves. Of course, the community didn't leave, and so they went in and got rid of all their houses in the middle of winter and kicked them out. So took a long time for the apologies to happen for that. It kind of got buried, and then the official apology didn't happen to 1990. So there's a whole community that was living and interacting with the landscape on the east side of the park that were completely removed from that landscape. The other thing from these signs, that period around 1909 is about the time that large pine logging started in Quetico. So, and it started on the north side and then kind of worked its way south. So close to the area that Lac La Croix is, and in their backyard. That's the large pine logging, floating logs down to sawmills in Fort Francis. So there was a lot of pressure there about don't be starting fires in the areas where we're logging.
Is Damon on via phone at all?
Damon got called to a fire. He's on detail, and then he was called to go respond to a fire
Gotcha.
during our panel time. So he's not with us right now.
Gotcha. Okay.
We'll have to try and synthesize some of what he shared with us previously for the group.
Understand.
Would it be worth talking about persistent places right now, Lee?
Yeah, sure. I can bring that up conceptually for the group, and maybe we have a slide we can jump to. And
Lee, maybe
Caitlin.
before you start that, I'll just add in while Caitlin's finding that slide. So one of the things that I want to emphasize too is that the tree ring record really doesn't make any sense without context. And, you can look at the tree ring record, or I can look at the tree ring record, and frankly, this is what I spent most of my career doing. And I can try to tell the story of what the trees are saying in terms of how often did a place burn, how frequent were fires, how spatially spread out were fires, what's the overall synchrony, and what's the driver of fire, whether it's climate or whether it's people. But that really it only goes part way. You really do have to have the context. And I think one of the challenges with context, particularly in the Upper Great Lakes, and other people can speak much more eloquently to this than I can, is that context is hard to get at, because a lot of the knowledge has been muddied in terms of the use of fire, the frequency of fire, where and why, some of that stuff. And maybe muddied isn't even the right way to put it. But maybe for somebody like speaking as individually, it's something that I don't want to say that traditional knowledge was unknown, but it wasn't maybe tapped or considered as strongly as maybe it should have. But when you look at the record of fire that we've developed from the tree ring record, it's hard to imagine that some of the places that we've been have enough lightning to burn the place 10 to 15 to 20 times in 120 years. It just seems very, very unlikely. So that automatically drops you back to thinking, well, what else was going on? And maybe what else was going on, or that there were people on the landscape that were using fire for a variety of purposes. And so maybe, Lee, that provides a little bit of a setup for thinking through the persistent places idea.
Yeah, thanks, Kurt. And we've kind of borrowed a term from Schlanger. She worked down in the Southwest in the ancestral Pueblo landscape, this concept of persistent places. And where we've looked, where we've actually dialed in and looked at a couple sites in the boundary water specifically, where we had comparatively high fire intervals, we had evidence of peeled trees, so purposefully peeled trees, and we really believe, we theorized that was for gum extraction for waterproofing canoes or containers. We've got really good archaeological evidence that people were at those places, during those while the fires, contemporaneous with them, not while the fires were occurring, but there's really good supporting evidence that people were there. They were utilizing those locations. So we tried to dial in on kind of a micro scale to some of these senescent red pine stands along the international border and along some secondary travel routes where we had really good information of, from both the historic record, the archaeological record, and oral history from Ojibwe elders. And, those multiple lines of evidence stacked up well. I mean, and I don't, Kurt, you can talk to maybe the seasonality of fire. That's something as a non-dendrochronologist, I don't really understand, but you can speak to, through the tree record to teasing out, the seasonality of when those fires may occur. This shot here is just an example of a stand on Lac La Croix near Fish Stake Narrows, where we had a lot of peeled trees. We had comparatively tight fire intervals. A really good record, I think, here going back to, say, the 1740s, maybe even a little earlier. We had really good archaeological context. We had a lot of artifacts that spoke to that 1780 to 1800 time period, when there was really a comparatively high use of the border route during the fur trade period. So kind of bringing all those threads together to really dig into these sites as persistent places. At a lot of these places too, we had ceramics that put people on those sites 500 years ago. We don't have the tree records that go back that far, but Sandy Lake pottery is something that archaeologists affiliate with ancestral Dakota folks. So pre-Ojibwe use of the landscape at some of these sites even. So that concept of persistent places, people coming back to these locations seasonally for specific resource purposes, during the fur trade for economic purposes, to engage in trade with passing canoe brigades. So that's just a little bit of the narrative that we tried to tease out from records beyond the dendrochronology. This is a case knife, 1780s to 1800 from that stand in Lac La Croix. Lane, maybe you can speak to this photo. That's a new one for me.
Yeah, so just along the lines of the persistent places concept, this is Burnside Lake, which is an area that Timo's familiar with, and some of you others would know well. So this idea that we have these fire-dependent landscapes that were lived in. So the island, it's at the image left, and then kind of zoomed in on, you can see a seasonal dwelling on the west side of the point of that island. And it's very typical kind of historical view of various portions of the border lakes, both the fire effects, mixed severity fire across different landforms, and then people living within that patch mosaic. And it's typical today to see sites like this looking very differently, but you still have the archaeological record and some cases the tree ring record that speaks to that historical use. And I think the reason we've latched onto this persistent places concept is that these same areas that were used historically by indigenous residents of Border Lakes Ojibwe, they're still used today recreationally. And so places that you experience when you're in the Border Lakes now, as a visitor, as a wilderness user, those are the same sites that people were dwelling in and using for subsistence for hundreds of years into the past. And so thinking about fire management in the future, if we're going to use these resources or these fire records and cultural records to inform future fire management, it helps for us to think about these persistent places as priority areas when thinking about 1 million acres or 2 million acres that need to see fire at some intervals. These specific sites that have been used over centuries could be a good place to start.
This graph is one, sorry to jump in, Lane, that Kurt pulled together, but these were 3 of the locations we really tried to dial in on where we had good archaeological data from the historic record, oral history. Fish Stake Narrows, again, up on La Croix. Saga Island, this is at the mouth of the Granite River where it dumps into Sag on the eastern side of the forest. And then Upper Poness Lake. This is along a canoe route that connected Vermilion Reservation to Lac La Croix First Nation, where there's a lot of familial connections. And we know from oral history that folks traveled back and forth between those communities along what's now known as the Little Indian Sioux River. Poness is a part of that. And so this is just trying to show, and Kurt, you can maybe speak to this a little bit too, how some of those peeled tree dates and fire dates stack up at some of those sites. Sorry to cut you off, Lane.
Yeah, I think that one of the, and I want to make a couple of quick points, I guess, is one thing that these are 3 that were pulled together because these are the 3 that I think, Lee, you have good archaeological data for, but we found their peel records, not just in these few places, but in a number of places across the boundary waters. and in Quetico. And so they're a more common feature than maybe what we'd expected. I know that I think Lane, you were the first person that I know of to identify these out on the landscape, and subsequently sampling the peel trees that look very different than fire scarred trees. Oftentimes they have tool marks on them, chop marks. You can see that they're different than the triangular face or triangular shaped cat face that's at the base of the tree. They're typically oblong, from about knee high to shoulder high. And they're contemporaneous with the fire scar record. So the trees are being peeled at the same time that fires are occurring on that landscape. So there are a lot of places that I tended, when we first started doing this, I tended to think that they would be located mostly on the main border route, but we are finding them in other places, like Pawn S is a good example. I think Cummings has some. And it's not just in the wilderness either. You know, there are peel trees elsewhere in the state of Minnesota that are associated with lakes or associated with rivers or old sites. So maybe they're more common than what we're giving them credit to, but they're also persistent. The red pines tend to stick around. There may have been many other trees that were peeled and species that were peeled for a variety of reasons, but we just don't have those records. So those have gone away.
But Damon's able to be here now. So Damon, it's good to see you on the call. Do you want to chime in at all? Or do you want us to continue the conversation and then get to some of the NEK concepts towards the end?
Yeah, that's cool. Yeah, you all can keep going, and then I'll just chime in when it's applicable.
Okay. So yeah, thinking about the application of this data, I think Brian's probably best equipped to speak to what's happening north of the boundary waters in Quetico. And Kaylin, I think the slide 17 would have some of Brian's content.
Okay, so I'll just just in case you're not familiar, a little bit of history of Quetico. So, you know, it's traditionally the Anishinaabe people lived on the land. And there was two periods. The initial European contact was around the fur trade. They used a couple of the traditional travel routes. The first one was along what's now the border. And that was used up to about 1800. And then when the border got put in place, essentially Grand Portage, because all the furs were traveling through the United States, the fur trade company did not want to pay all the taxes that the U.S. government decided that they should be paying, and switched the route to the north. So moved the fur trade site from Grand Portage up to Fort William, we're now Thunder Bay, and shifted the route to the north, which in Quetico means the route changed and came through Pickerel Lake, down through Sturgeon Lake, and out to Lac La Croix, joined the old route near Lac La Croix. That lasted till about 1820, and then the fur trade company, the XY company, Nor'westers, got bought or amalgamated with the Hudson Bay Company, and they ran on a completely different model. It wasn't fur brigades going out to the people. They built a bunch of posts and had people come to the posts. So that was kind of the end of the fur trade. The other period of use in the park, kind of briefly, was that northern route was used as what's known as the Dawson Trail. So prior to the railroad tracks getting built across Canada, they were looking for a all-Canadian route to the west, in particular Winnipeg area, Red River Valley. They reopened and had something to, originally the impetus was to the Riel Rebellion that was going on in Manitoba at the time. And they reopened up that northern fur trade route, the one you can see kind of the north one there on that map that Lane's put up for you. So that was in between those periods, you know, there wasn't a whole lot going on until other than traditional use from First Nation people out interacting with the landscape. And as I mentioned earlier, there was the two groups. The one that had the reserve ended after the treaty, had a reserve at Lac La Croix, and the one that had the reserve at Cowa Bay, which is, you can see on the map there on the east side, and then discuss what happened at Cowa. Everything kind of changed in around 1900. So the tracks were built just north of the park, came through Atikokan, and shortly after that, the logging occurred, and it started in the north west corner and kind of worked its way east across the northern edge till about Pickerel, and then worked its way south down to Sturgeon Lake. A little bit of logging south of that down in McCree, but that northwest corner was heavily logged for large pine at the time, and that went on until the 40s, and there was a little bit of pulp logging in the northeast corner, and that was all ended in 1971. So as we talked before, it became a park around the same time. Superior Forest was protected around 1909 to 1913, became a park. Was classed as a wilderness park in 1977, and that was the first management plan for the park. There's a big study that's still well referenced called the Woodson Day study, where they looked at the fire history, which was essentially redoing what Bud Heinzelman had done south of the border in Quetico. So same type of idea. What was the fire cycle? What was the historical fire history? And came up with essentially the same answer. It was focused on stand replacing fire, but that the historical fire cycle was somewhere around 75 to 100 years. And even in 1977, it was a lot longer than that. The fire cycle had stretched out to around 1,000 years. And that was mentioned right in the plan. And there was a bunch of discussion about stuff, the things that Timo mentioned earlier. We're going to see shifts in forest structure, balsam fir, which was an inconsequential part of the forest community, was going to, we're going to see fewer pines, and we're going to see more mixed forest with a lot more balsam fir. There was discussion early on about, we need to address this. We need a fire management plan. Although there was a footnote to this, we need a fire management plan, we need a fire management plan when we can completely control the risk. Another thing that Timo mentioned, which we still, I think, deal with today. So the first fire management plan came along in 1996, and the intent was to allow a lot more fires to burn naturally. They dealt with they created these compartments. So there was a core area of the park that we're going to try and let stuff burn, and this big area, about a third of the park around the edges, that they were they called monitored response, which they would try to let them burn, but they'd be more suppression. Their concern was fire escaping from the park into the managed forest outside. In reality, every fire in that outside core was put out, or almost everyone. Even small island fires, they jump on them because of risk stuff. Shortly after that, the Ontario Parks amended their new Provincial Parks and Conservation Act, and the statement about ecological integrity was put in as a first priority for management of all Ontario parks. So that's the box up front there that defines what ecological integrity. So it's The first priority would be for to maintain these natural systems, natural processes, native species, rates of change, and natural processes occurring. And I think there's certainly some issues with the wording around there. And what do you mean by natural? Is that historical? Is that no human stuff? I think we're still, as Ontario Parks is still wrestling with especially the cultural impacts of this. That idea that somewhere out there was some place that people had no influence on, and that's the goal. That's this idea of we should be going back to that, although that's very different than what the historical thing would be. So that it was a big change, because I think up to then in Ontario, to say, yeah, we're managing parks to be aesthetically pleasing places that people want to go visit was valid, but this supposedly was a big change, to know the priority will be having these things as this ecological integrity becomes the most important thing. So the 2009, we redid the fire management plan in 2009. There was a couple more things around compartments, ideas that they identified a few more compartments, how they wanted them, identified specific objectives for these compartments, and prescribed burns, which were in the 96 plan, just as where they were kind of needed for safety, to remove, if there was blowdown, we could do a prescribed burn to eliminate that risk, which had happened a couple of times right around 2001. Now prescribed burn could be used as we could put fire on the ground. Since then, there's also been this idea of the Ontario redid its wildfire policy in 2014 for the province, and the parks just kind of adopted a parks wildfire policy based on it. And one of the big changes in that is a fire is a fire. It doesn't matter what started it. Originally, there was a difference between a lightning caused fire and a human caused fire. We tend to, this idea, we jump on a human caused fire, but we let lightning caused fires go. Now this idea of a fire is a fire, and we'll assess every fire individually on whether we can allow it to burn or not. The current plan has a couple, some issues with it, and we're supposed, so the current plan was supposed to run for 10 years. It's been over 10 years now, but we're in the early processes of rewriting it. COVID didn't help anything with getting everything going, but there's some technical issues. Some of the operational stuff didn't really follow the objectives. Some of the targets are unrealistic. And it really is focused on partly this boreal thing. A lot of the modeling is focused on that we use in Ontario is more of a boreal forest, stand replacing fire. It dominates as soon as you get north of the transition zone. It's pretty much stand replacing fire everywhere in a jack pine spruce dominated forest. So it had talked about surface fires and in red and white pine, but didn't really set any targets or what did that mean. So that was one of the issues. But the biggest problem with the plan was that it didn't include any voice from the Indigenous people, especially Lac La Croix. There's an agreement with Lac La Croix, and there's complicated reasons why it didn't happen, but there was no input from Lac La Croix in this plan. It was actually one of the management actions as the plan was go talk to Lac La Croix about what we decided in the plan. One of the, shortly after that, we redid the Quetico Park management plan, and it updated from a 96 update or 94 update. But one of the biggest and most important statements in that plan is a statement, a principle around shared resource decision-making with Lac La Croix. And so the middle section of that slide, you'll see some stuff out of the Quetico Park management plan. There's this idea we're going to have this ecological integrity, natural stuff. We're all a little bit of conflict, I think, now how we understand that with the next line is we're also going to allow indigenous cultural activities. And if you interpret natural as non-human and indigenous, the indigenous, Anishinaabe and cultural activities to include things like fire on the land, there's a bit of a conflict there. But that statement about shared resource decision-making with Lac La Croix First Nation has really been a changer. So the kind of the history of first engagement with the First Nation people, there's for a long time, for as long as I've been working, which has been a long time, there's been this duty to consult idea. But at one point it was, we would make a decision, we would go to the communities with our decision. We'd call it consultation, but in the early days, it was just, we're here to tell you what we've decided. That was pretty quick. I think people that were like me that were tasked with going to do that realized pretty quickly that that wasn't working. It was a very awkward conversation to say, we're consulting with you, but doesn't really matter what you say. The next approach was we would decide, here's what's important, here's management options. We haven't decided anything yet, but here's we haven't finally decided, but we've decided what the options are, and we decided what the issues and the important stuff is. You can help us decide which option we want to go with, but it's within our box. And there's also this traditional ecological knowledge became a big thing, but again, it was, we're asking stuff that fits within our box. So you tell us values on the landscape. You tell us where the spawning sites are that you know of, that we don't know of, and we'll go out and check and make sure that, oh yeah, they are a spawning site. That was the type of stuff. The current approach, based on this shared resource decision-making, is First Nation communities are on the planning team. So from the very beginning, actually the planning team, we just finished a aquatic ecosystem fisheries management plan for Quetico, or just finished the draft for it. The planning team was co-chaired by the park superintendent and the chief of Lac La Croix. We had elders, 4 people. Yeah, it started out with 4 people on the community on the planning team. So right from the beginning, what are the things that are important? What are the objectives you want to see? How do we develop options to move forward with better managing the park? So this is in the idea, although I hadn't actually heard of two-eyed seeing at the time. That's kind of where we're heading to, or that's where we're trying to get. So this is Western science, or whatever term we want to use, but the traditional Western science that our culture uses, and this native ecological knowledge that the communities, often this oral history or experiential stuff based on their interaction with the landscape, and how do we bring those two together on a kind of a parallel path, and how do we use both that information to move forward? And there's a couple points of that. Using the strength of both knowledge systems are equally valid, and one doesn't need to collaborate the other. And that's important, because a lot of the stuff from or a lot of stuff from traditional knowledge, Western science has no way of corroborating that. So if you don't accept it as valid, you can't validate it through Western science. So that what's referred to in this diagram as the ethical space, the planning approach, that is what shared resource decision making in Quetico Park. That's the space we're trying to hit to move forward with decision making.
And Brian, I would just say your slide there on all knowledge systems are equally valid, kind of, it reminds me of, the early elder interviews we did talking about fire, where elders told us we burned all the time. And we're like, can you tell us more, like specifically? And they're like, well, not really, and then, so in our Western science approach, we wanted to go out to prove that, you know what I mean? And we don't necessarily need to. We can take it, where it is. And Damon, I'm seeing you shake your head, but I mean, that's part of, I think, it's not a folly on our part, but that's something that we wanted the evidence to support that oral history, and maybe that's not necessary. I mean, I think we can all agree that humans were a prominent ignition source, and where do we go from there? What does that mean?
Yeah, I'll just one more little comment here, and then I'll let Damon speak. So part of it is that if we didn't, at one point, if we didn't have the data, then we kind of went, I don't know whether that's really true or not, right? So that was 20 years ago, that was the world of our relationship with the community. The other thing is, we deal with the physical, you got to see it, measure it, count it, or we don't know how to deal with it. And it doesn't take very long talking to First Nation communities. There's a whole element that they see the land, that is not in a physical measurable state. And it's very important that spiritual element is very important to how guides their decision making. If you don't accept it, you can't measure it. So that's an important thing to understand, to get past, and to accept, if you to deal with as an equal approach. Damon.
Yeah, right on. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, sorry I joined late. I actually had a fire call, but to kind of piggyback on what Lee was talking about, we definitely see two different ways of thinking about fire within the different approaches with tribal communities and with our land management agencies. And I think from the tribal perspective, it seems to be like a little bit more comfort with just getting fire on the ground and let's do it, make it happen. And so, but what we've seen over at Apostle Islands National Lakeshore with our approach is that we've integrated tribal experiential knowledge into our land management practice to really integrate the two. And so we're seeing that where science falls short and there's a gap in the science, our TEK will fill that in, or where there's a gap in the TEK, our science will fill that in. And so we can collaborate those two together to really make some pretty sound decisions based on management, or for management. And I saw in the questions there's one about what are the tribe's priorities, and I responded with land management agencies should start working with tribes, the TIPO office, the Tribal Historic Preservation Office, natural resources departments, to really start, not afterwards, not after you've already decided to do your project and say like, hey, here's the project we're going to do, but as the projects are started, or as you're or thinking about projects, integrate those ideas into it to really kind of blend those thoughts, and reach out to your local tribes, and they'll tell you who else has interest in everything like that. One thing, the slide that I wanted to show here as if I could show one slide in this panel, this is it. And it for everybody, it just looks like a guy, watching a backing fire. But who this is, so this is out on Stockton Island, Fossil Islands National Lakeshore, on our first reintroduction of fire back into the landscape on Stockton Island. And this guy right here is a Red Cliff tribal member. And he had just gotten red carded, and this was his first burn that he participated in. And his great grandparents would have been the people that were out on that island picking berries and burning that space, and managing that landscape for blueberries, and managing that landscape for all the other reasons that natives burned. And then as a result of the federal policies and all the other different things that were going on, that stopped. And so that traditional cultural practice stopped. That traditional transmission of understanding of fire and our relationship to the landscape through fire stopped. And then 2 generations later, this young man gets red carded, and he comes back out to close that gap and close that and start bringing that spirit of fire back into our common space, right? So this is the one that I really wanted to share with everybody, because I think what this shows is our ability as land management folks to really integrate our land base original managers back into the decision making process and back into the implementation process. And I don't say that as like we know everything and we're right about everything, but let's at least collaborate and get together on making decisions about our spaces. So, and I see that's happening, in the Superior and Quetico, and over by us is happening, and all over land management agencies are starting to really, not because they have to, but because they feel like it's a good thing to do, and it's the right thing to do, is to bring that experience into the mix. So yeah, I hope I saw, and there also this oppression thing, and I think that's a really important point to make, because we all know that the federal government, there was a policy to oppress or suppress the culture of the people, and with language and stories and ceremonies and our traditional cultural lifeways that were either outlawed or oppressed in some way. Fire and our relationship with fire to the landscape is just one aspect of that. And so when you think of, the ability, I'm involved with a lot of different things with language revitalization and cultural revitalization and ceremonial things. And the knowledge base of, think of like a birch bark canoe, and how much knowledge and experiential relationship goes into building that canoe, and all the different intricacies of making that construction happen, and the gathering and the ceremony that's involved in it. Think about that with fire, and about our relationship with fire to the landscape. And if we had that much intimate knowledge about just making canoe, think of how much we had about fire in the landscape, and how easily they're in our communities in this area, there are probably only about 5 canoe makers. And think of how many there used to be, right? And if you apply that same thinking to people that were applying fire, and the knowledge that they carried and passed on, same idea, right? So again, it's just about right now, for me, it's about looking into the future. What are we doing into the future? The past is the past, and we can learn from that, and we can learn from all the things that happen. But as we go forward, let's be on the right page of this, and let's be in the right direction with this, and integrate and work with each other to manage our sacred spaces, right? Sacred for all of us.
Hey, Damon, can I piggyback on something?
Yeah.
Because when you brought up Stockton, and I think that this is actually a really critical thing to think about too. So I did some fire history on Stockton Island, and Damon was out with us when we were doing the collections, and I remember thinking that it was really hard for us to develop those collections because there's not a lot of record left from the tree ring record perspective. But we were able to reconstruct some fire events. But one of the things that I'm constantly reminded in discussions in conversations with Damon is that the tree rings tell us part of the story, but a lot of that record still gets lost. And just because the trees, I saw it in the comments too, the absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. Sometimes trees don't get scarred by fires. Sometimes trees burn up by fires. And I feel like we've maybe are starting to make this shift. And BJ, Brian sort of talked about this a little bit, where we don't necessarily have to have like all of the evidence of fire in a particular place to know that it was used and it was important. Yeah, it's helpful in some cases, but, and I think Lee, you mentioned this too, it's like we know that fire was an important tool. We know that it was used pretty widely for a variety of different uses. We know that there are particular places on the landscape where it was used. So do you really have to have the tree ring record to help suss that out? And I think in some cases it's helpful because it helps to reconnect communities back to fire use at earlier times. But in other cases, I think it may not be all that important. I know that the record on the Apostle Islands or on Stockton Island is incomplete, but that doesn't mean that fire wasn't used in particular places on the island or whatever, because we know that there's oral history and tradition that tells us otherwise. Just because the trees don't necessarily record that, although in a lot of cases they do, that doesn't mean it doesn't exist.
Damon, something that Timo was talking about earlier when he was opening up today was just this idea of experiential knowledge, lessons learned from fire, being a student of fire in place. And that's something that kind of came up in the conversations we had leading up to this panel, is the differences between traditional ecological knowledge and then native experiential knowledge. And I think you've done the best job of conveying that to us. And
Right.
I'm wondering if you can kind of differentiate between those two things for the whole group.
Right. Yeah. So what we've been trying to use over at Apostle Islands is this native experiential knowledge, and that came about because we see that traditional ecological knowledge in some ways keeps ideas, or it keeps going into the past and doesn't really maintain this or keep us in the present or even the future. It's always kind of looking back, and then it isn't always ecological knowledge. So BJ was talking about that. There's our cultural relationship with this landscape and the culture. And when I say our, I mean us, all of us. I don't mean just Native people. All of us have a relationship with our landscape and where we're from. As a firefighter, we get to travel across the country, and I'm always looking for fish fries on Friday nights, right? Because that's what we do around here. But that's a thing, right? And we all have cultural relationships with our landscape based on that landscape. And so in this area, we all know the winters, we all know the mosquitoes, we all know all that stuff, and that stuff shapes who we are. And so that's where we get the native part. Is if you're a native from an area, you know that area, like just like your house, or when things are happening, and things that are happening in the environment and going on around you. And then the experiential part helps to try and again make that more inclusive, to that everybody who's a practitioner of their landscape, with fire or with gathering or with anything else, that knowledge that you gain through that can be transmitted to other people. That's it. It isn't, again, just ecological. It's about the stories, the relationships, the understandings, the values that you have because of that. So it's not always ecological. So that's why we've been trying to utilize that NEK instead of the TEK, just as a way to bring everybody into the mix. Again, like it's kind of like the Leopold thing, where we're all a part of this, and we're not outside of any of this. We're all very much integrated into the landscape and where we're from, and the decisions we make should reflect that. So. I saw in the questions too, they're talking about field staff from all agencies collecting burn scar locations. I don't know if you all talked about your app or not, but that might be something cool to bring up, or if you don't want to bring that up.
I think is it coming up on the agenda?
Oh, is it? Oh,
no.
cool. Yeah.
I'm not
Sure,
sure.
Yeah,
tomorrow.
Yeah, tomorrow we will have
Okay, sweet. Perfect.
a slot of time for that. Yeah.
Yeah, because I've been out in the every time I'm out in the woods, I'm taking shots and submitting them. But that, that helps to tell the story and like fill in those gaps of understanding. So that's super important as well.
It seems like
Yeah.
now would be a good time to open up for more questions from the audience. Unless Lee, you want to.
No, I was just going to bring up a quote that sort of close out maybe this session from Damon from one of our conversations that I thought is appropriate maybe to end on and pick up questions is, Damon kind of contextualizes it as restoring a cultural practice that is a requirement for this landscape. We talk a lot about rationale for putting fire on the ground for ecological purposes, but I think to flip the script and to think about it that way is instructive. Restoring a cultural practice that is a requirement of this landscape. When we talk about a rationale for putting fire on the ground, I think if anyone, leaves this conversation with something to think about, to mull over, I think it's a really good piece. So Damon, I just wanted to throw that out there for folks. I think it's really, really good.
And BJ, that was on your slide too. There was a comment about a healthy landscape includes people, and that without people that the landscape doesn't feel healthy. I'm paraphrasing. I don't remember exactly what it was, but something along those lines. And I think that that's something worth thinking about with respect to these, especially the red pine forests. If you want, red pine campsites that are beautiful to camp in, that aren't full of balsam fir, yeah, you can sit around waiting for lightning to do the job, or you can start to think about whether or not that job has been done for so long by people, and maybe that we need to, moving forward, I guess this gets to Damon's idea. How do we move forward? How do we use this information? And I think the combination between the tree rings and oral history and cultural history kind of come together to really start to tell us that if we want a particular type of landscape, or we consider it to be valuable to us, this persistent places idea, then we might need to be thinking about how we move that forward. And it may require some more hands-on work, to thinking back to Timo's presentation.
Yeah, this isn't a fire example, but when we were the planning team around the aquatic ecosystem plan for Quetico, we asked something about places or something. In particular, they had lots of more knowledge when we were talking Lac La Croix. They had more knowledge around closer to Lac La Croix, and we were asking broader areas in the park and wetlands and native traditional areas for harvesting medicines and stuff like that. And there's some silence kind of, and we've been asking about healthy ecosystem, and we hadn't got a really super clear answer out of them. And they kind of looked at each other. Just at our planning team meetings, a common thing, which they would usually apologize for, but they would have discussions in Anishinaabewin. Mostly, it wasn't to have a private discussion and avoid us. It was because there was terms and concepts that they could only, there either wasn't English words for. So they would have a conversation, and then then they would try to explain what that meant to us in English, because most of this stuff they said it's not we're having private conversations. It's just you guys don't have words to describe this. And so the one thing that came up was, especially when it got to the east side of the park, they would not call it a healthy ecosystem because of the removal of Cowa Bay and a bunch of stuff. They were no longer on the landscape, so they could not fulfill their sacred responsibility to be stewards of the land. And if they couldn't do that, how could the landscape be healthy? So we have this objective in the plan, and this kind of throws people a little bit of getting the people the community and the back out on the landscape as an objective, and how do we develop some management actions that would at the very least remove barriers or assist in helping them get back in the landscape. And often people are, this is a fisheries and aquatic ecosystem, like what's that got to do with it? And from a our culture's perspective, it maybe doesn't seem to be that big of a deal, but from their perspective, it's critical to having a healthy ecosystem that they're there as part of that stewardship.
All right, great. Do we want to jump into some of the questions that we've got on Slido? All right, I'm getting a thumbs up. So I think, Damon, you may have touched on this already, but I don't know if you want to elaborate at all. There was a comment that many have argued that fire suppression was a form of oppression to criminalize traditional indigenous subsistence and further force indigenous people from the land. So I'll leave it up to you if you want to elaborate on that.
I think Kurt made a really good point before in our conversations about this, is that so not only and we know that early 1900s, after 1910 and everything on, we know that it was the federal policy was suppression of all ignitions. And we also know that through communicating with elders about all the other different penalties that they faced for off-reservation hunting, fishing, gathering, all that stuff was going on. So this is just a part of that. And so what Kurt was talking about is that in this case, it might not even be about suppression of fire, but it might be suppression of ignitions, where people are influenced so much that you just don't even start a fire anymore because you know that you're going to get in trouble for it. If I know, Lane, if you showed that the flyer that was posted on that tree, and can you imagine paying $5,000 and leaving your family, for a month or 2 months or however long you're in jail for? That was enough, and people were experiencing that by when they would go off reservation to hunt, when they would go off reservation to fish, they would either get arrested for that and we actually in our reservation talked to elders who came up with different ways of getting around that stuff. And that's one of the reasons why they would hunt at night, is to get around that the policy of not being able to fit it or hunt off reservation. So they do it at nighttime. So like there's all sorts of different examples that you can just kind of plug fire into that and say that, yep, same exact thing, basically.
Great.
Lee, maybe you can expand on that a little bit more with what was happening on the Superior with the early forest rangers, like 1910, 1911, 1912. I mean, those rangers were, what was their primary duties in the summer months?
I mean, reading the early journals of the forest guards, they called them at the time. The Superior was created in 1909. I mean, their first job was to get out and do fire patrol and establish trails and caches for fire tools and fire lookout. It was all about fire patrols, and also like verifying stone and timber claims within the forest. But yeah, I mean, it was all about fire suppression. It was all about getting travel networks in so they could access this really remote chunk of forest to get in and put all fires out before noon the next day. That's what it was all about, right? That was the Forest Service policy for many years, is every fire is out before noon the next day. It doesn't matter wildfire use or whatnot. So is that get at what you're asking?
Yeah, and it's really like an example of, I guess, what I consider to be this all-seeing eye of the government, and that if you have agents of the government, federal government or state government everywhere watching and waiting to follow up on some sort of stewardship activity that you're taking part in.
Yeah.
It's a huge disincentive to being out and doing those things if you know you're going to get slapped with a fine or jailed or something else.
Well, and they also inherited lands that were already, the timber was already sold to timber companies that wasn't cut off the stump yet. So part of it was protecting the dollar too. It was just protecting, for the Boundary Waters region, Swallow Hopkins, St. Croix timber companies had vast holdings of clear grain red pine and white pine that they were getting after, and they paid for part of the salaries of those early forest guards. So it wasn't just, you know, federal taxpayer money, it was timber companies that were also paying those forest guards. They were called cooperative forest guards, you know. So they were paid for by timber companies too. Yeah.
Hey, can I jump in for a second?
Yeah.
So one of the things that we've kind of come back, we go back and forth, we talk about a lot, is that when we talk about like the fire history that we've developed from tree rings, we oftentimes fall back to the wilderness and the boundary waters or national parks or these other little sort of isolated, federally managed landscapes. I want to make sure that we're clear that this is not a wilderness issue and it's not a national parks issue. That fire histories in red pine have been developed in a lot of different places where we're seeing these really, really short interval fires. And some of these places are nowhere near what we would consider to be wilderness. And so I don't want people to think that we're talking about a very restricted area or a restricted landscape. Those areas are maybe restricted today based on how we've drawn artificial boundaries. But I think in the past, that's a lot different. I mean, we have work going on in a lot of different landscapes right now, private lands, state forests, state parks. A lot of this is what's left there because that's where we find materials, but you can walk into a lot of different landscapes and find fire scarred stumps, places that you would not even expect them to be. So while we oftentimes do this fallback to the boundary waters or to other federally protected areas, that's because those are places where we have really good archaeological evidence because those are places that are being surveyed for a variety of reasons. We oftentimes have old growth forests still in place that help us to date the fires, but we also oftentimes have stumps. But there are lots of landscapes that wouldn't fall underneath the wilderness or any other designation that also were important for indigenous use or are important today for whatever reason that I don't want people to think that this is just a wilderness story because it's not a wilderness story. It's a red pine or a boreal forest story. And we know that those sorts of landscapes are under threat for a lot of reasons right now.
That's great. Yeah. And so our next question, kind of feeding into it a little bit here. Can you please characterize the opportunities for indigenous cultural burning and for non-industrial private forest owner burning and the current and expected pathways to empower more such burning?
I don't even know if there is any current and expected pathways to do this kind of, I mean, like when I burn at my house, I burn around my house just for opening it up and keeping it open. I just get a leaf burning permit and I do some broad scale, I do some landscape burning. But I've had that question before where people are like, how do I do this at home? And without having to do a burn plan or having all sorts of people. And again, that kind of gets to this idea that, again, we have different mindsets about fire. And there's one side where you need planning and burn plans and burn bosses and stuff like that. And the other one is you just do it locally. But yeah, that's a good question.
I'd respond to that saying there are lots of opportunities and we need to have these types of conversations between resource managers and the communities that care about those resources. And that can be both, like what we consider to be American cultural communities and then, Ojibwe or more indigenous thinking communities, but creating space for those conversations and then making it a priority, prioritizing that type of planning and that type of work over some of the other things that we can be have suck up our energy and our time. I think that's maybe more of a challenge than anything, but making it in your top 3 in your to-do list. That's how we get this stuff done, by making it one of the most important things that we can do with our time and our resources.
And I would add on that too, Lane, just as far as empowering that type of burning. I think my goal is always to tell the story, and to provide to suggest or present a more nuanced perspective of the history of fire use, let's just say in the Western Superior Basin or wherever we want to talk about. And, you know, in my job, I make recommendations and present the story, if you will, to management. And that's, I think, that's where I hope the story empowers each and every one of you to consider, you know, the more nuanced approach or the complex history. And I think, to me, that story hopefully empowers putting more fire on the ground, more rationale for it. I guess for me, that's where I come from. I could maybe, unless there's additional thoughts on that first one, I can jump to that second one there.
One quick thought before you jump away,
yeah.
and that's just to say that the use of fire wasn't just restricted to the Ojibwe or anybody else, right? I mean, fire was used widely at the turn of the century I don't know what the history is in the Southeast, but burning of the back 40 in southeastern, I think longleaf pine forest was a pretty common practice. And it was a pretty common practice around the upper Great Lakes too, regular burning by both native peoples and by white settlers. And some of that was an exchange of knowledge that was going on. And some of that was just bringing the technology with them. I mean, cultural burning is not unique. Cultural burning is worldwide. We've had this conversation when we were doing some of the planning meetings, but we rely on fire as a species for a lot of different reasons. And it's just a very, very important tool to our evolution as a culture, I think, overall. So that's something that I think we need to keep in mind. It's not that like we're just going to adopt a traditional experiential knowledge or traditional ecological knowledge. We're going to readopt fire as a tool for our species as a whole. I think that maybe captures some of our earlier discussions that we've had as a group. Sorry, Lee, I mean to jump on your toes.
Quite all right. No, I was just going to say for this this question that's highlighted right now, how can young and upcoming natural resource professionals learn to respectfully be inclusive to Indigenous people's perspectives and knowledge early in their careers? I would ask others to jump in on this too, but I think, you know, Timo hit on this a little bit. I'm paraphrasing, but to be a student of fire, to be a student of place, I think that's a big part of it. Is you know, and Timo also talked about the problem that we have too with people cycling through leadership positions and you know how quickly it is. And that's one thing folks always ask me here is like, how can we be, you know, how can we consult, you know, better in good faith with the tribes? And you know, part of me always wants to be like, well, stick around for a while, establish relationships, and get to know that community, you know. And I think for folks that are young in their career, technicians putting fire on the ground, it's to try to get BIA crews to help with RX fires on your forest. Try to get you know, your neighboring land management folks. The tribes have great fire crews, and to get them on. I think just up until a couple of years ago, it was a real problem for the Superior to bring on non-Forest Service crews to help with prescribed fire. And I think we made some changes now that it's a lot easier to get DOI, BIA crews on, but establish relationships, be a student of place, be a student of fire, and be open. I think be open to different perspectives. I would just ask other folks to jump in on that. I think that would be my
I would emphasize that the idea of conversation, just starting the conversation and not expecting it to happen overnight. It takes a lot of time to build trust amongst individuals that don't always know each other real well. And I think that that's the normal social process. And the conversations, I think since young, I think it says young and upcoming natural resource professionals, start now, start having that conversation. I feel like I started too late in some ways. But like having that conversation early and as often as possible. And it doesn't have to be over formal stuff. You know, you run into people at a trailhead, you know, you go out for hikes in the field or do whatever. I mean, that's, I feel like, been the most valuable part of my sort of interactions over the last 10 years have been almost informal, just wandering around in the woods looking at stuff. And I oftentimes joke, it's like, wow, I came out here to collect fire scars. We collected one. But I came away knowing way, way more about fire and about the landscape just because I spent that time with people that knew it better than me. And I think that that's really, really valuable, but that takes time. So I would say just time. You can't, it's hard. It takes a lot of effort and a lot of trust building.
Yeah, to jump on that, I think the one thing I could say is show up. Show up to anything you can, powwows that are going on, or other events that are going on, or things that are happening that where you're not always asking for something, where you're just there to, to help support what they're doing and things like that. I know that the superintendent up at Grand Portage, him and the tribal chair used to have a lot of make a lot of decisions watching, the high school football games where they're sitting in the audience just hanging out together, and maybe they talked about work and maybe they didn't. But you're not going to, obviously the federal government has a pretty interesting relationship with tribes, and so people still are aware of that. And we're not talking about 100 years ago. We're talking about 10 years ago or 5 years ago. So people have talk about trust. It's that trust has been eroded for a while. So building that back up, you have to be human with each other first.
Yeah, I think that's that's been our experience in Quetico. It's all about relationship, it's all about trust, it's all about time. It's easy to say, oh yeah, well, I don't think like that anymore. I'm here ready to listen. But when you're sitting across from an elder who's had a whole lifetime of, yeah, I've had people say that to me before, like it's just, you can't expect, oh yeah, trust me this time, right? So it takes time, it takes personal relationships, it takes time and trust before they can tell you things that you can't. There's stuff that you're told that you cannot tell anybody else. To get to that level with a community or a person takes years of time, and I think that's in our past. The idea of we want to float in, have a couple meetings, get the answers to our questions, just doesn't work. And the other thing I would say, go in, and listen. That before you start talking, start listening, because they've had decades and decades and centuries of the relationship has been one side talking and not listening.
That's great. So we've got a few more minutes left. So if we want to tackle any other questions, you guys have been just kind of pulling them off the screen. So I'm going to let you just choose if there's something that jumps out at you on there.
Let's do the one that's a question to Kurt about the jump in fires in the 1700s.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So the question about whether it's part of that might be the reduction of fire in the early 1700s is an artifact of a lack of samples, or just the breakdown of disintegration on the landscape. Yes, possibly that's always an issue, and the statistician in me wants to say, oh yeah, that's something we really, really need to be aware of. And at first, I think when we first started doing this work, that might have been what I would have, as we had maybe one or two sites where you'd see, oh yeah, the fire history back prior to 1700 or maybe into 1750, just we don't have the sample depth, we call it sample depth, to really tell the full story. I think now that we've been to many, many, many more places and have developed reconstructions that go back a long way, I think it's a real effect. I think that reduced fire activity before about 1730s is actually real. And that the figure that I actually use of 744 trees, I looked it up and I can't remember what it was, but I think at 1700, I think we have like 300 samples already that go back that far that would be recording fires. So that's a tremendous number of trees. So I think that the more we know and the more we collect, the more I say that really looks like a real effect. Early, when we were first doing this, I wasn't so sure. Now I'm much more comfortable saying, look, there's a burning pattern here that seems to be more strongly related to the context, the cultural context of that particular landscape. And it's not just an artifact of lack of samples. So that's the longest short answer.
I would add to that from a historical perspective too, something for the group to consider, that we know that if, and again, I know this conversation isn't about the boundary waters, but bringing it back to the boundary waters, from about 16, that was always contested space. Not always, but at the time of European contact, there was a Dakota Ojibwe moving into that landscape, and it was contested space. There was peace established 1690 by Sir Duluth that lasted until about 1736, and then hostilities broke out again. So I think there is also a historical narrative that could add some context to that. If it's contested space, if people aren't comfortable sitting down on the landscape, if it's a battle zone, if you will, you're going to see maybe that's explains something. At about 1730 till about 1780, it was contested space between Anishinaabe and Dakota.
And I would say that also, just kind of related, at an earlier stage in my career, when I would have looked at that fire record, probably the first thing I would have thought about is that, wow, there's a lot of fire after about 1730 to the 1900s. Well, I know why we don't have fire in the 1900s, because we were putting them all out. But that big shift right in there, if we had enough samples, I probably would have initially said, oh, I wonder if there's a change in vegetation or a change in climate. That would have been my first thing that's the first go-to thing I would have gone after. I look at the upper Great Lakes, and the tree rings tell you one thing, but with the cultural context in the background that goes along with that I just think, as my knowledge is improved and my discussions with actually most of the panelists here, I think that our perspective changes enough to know that, like, we really do need to be thinking about it from a much larger standpoint. And it's not just climate, although that's important, but there's a human component here that's really, really key. And you can see it in the boundary waters because we know a lot more about the boundary waters history. But there are other places on the landscape that have similar type of stories. So I'm thinking specifically about some of the places we worked in Itasca State Park or in Cass Lake and in the Chippewa National Forest or over in Leech Lake area. There's contemporaneous fire activity that can be linked together with human use of the landscape that I think is important. And so prior to those time periods, fire events are more rare, but all of a sudden we know people are there, and the fire history picks up. And so we start to see short interval fires, one right after the other, as that landscape is being used. So